the women and men and children who make up humankind are faced with challenges that are perhaps on a scale that's not comparable to any other time in human history. The climate emergency is first and foremost, but there are others. You know, the threat, the opportunities, but also the threat posed by artificial intelligence and so on. There are many others. We're simply not going to be able to solve these problems if we are so divided and we can't agree on anything. And I think that's where the bad kind of division and disagreement, the bad kind of polarization can really lead us to ruin.
No, I completely agree. And so let's dial it back for a moment and then we go to what you just mentioned, like climate change, for example. But when I'm curious how you see where is the good polarization turning into bad polarization. So what's actually, how can we define certain qualities that would say like this part of polarization is actually a healthy dynamism in a society that keeps the societal evolution going, and then there is a fault line, and then when we cross that fault line, like then it actually becomes destructive somehow. Would do you have some parameters that would indicate, okay, this is polarization that is actually more healthy and it's a dynamic process between people? What are qualities that you would give that kind of polarization so that we can see, oh, we can learn to distinguish these two and say, okay, this is one and this is the other. How would you say that?
Well, I think that that probably depends on each sort of cultural context, but there seems to be one sort of attribute that I think is worrying, is sort of what's called intergroup contact. So intergroup contact basically describes how many people do you know or are you in contact with that are not part of your group, not part of your in group. So, you know, social scientists refer to in groups and out groups. And when there's very little intergroup contact, then I think that's quite worrying, because it suggests that sort of hardened groups have formed. And that leads you down the path of what I was describing earlier, which is this tribal version of polarization. It doesn't matter what we think or what we do. The most important thing is to beat the other team. So societies that have more intergroup contact, whether it's through school or housing, or the organization of housing or social clubs or sports teams, or, you know, Robert Putnam, the great American scholar, had published this very important book called Bowling Alone. When, you know, when people start to not really have that much group interactions with people who are different from them, but also when people start to have fewer and fewer interactions. I think this is all also linked to a crisis of loneliness, which is happening all around the world. But I think when there's less intergroup contact, that's quite worrying. That tells me you're drifting from one kind, well, from sort of healthy disagreement into that. The other thing is, and this is hard to measure, but I think it's close to the work that you do, which is it's really about listening. I very often tell this story that in our research, we conduct focus groups on a variety of topics all over Europe and the US. And as is common practice, we pay participants a little bit of money to join a 2 hour focus group to talk about climate change or the cost of living crisis, or the elections or whatever. And very often what happens at the end, so a focus group is, for people who don't know, is generally 8 people and you talk about a wide range of topics for 2 hours. These are people who don't know one another. And what very happens at the end of these focus groups is that people say, you know, that felt really good. Like, I haven't really spent 2 hours talking to people I don't know about stuff in decades. And so what very often, almost all the time, they say thank you. You know, they say, really, thank you for doing this. It feels good to talk about stuff. And then it happened to us just last week. Participants sometimes say, can I please come back tomorrow? But you don't need to pay me. I'll come back for free. I just liked the experience. And so I think there's also kind of a crisis of loneliness, but also listening, like the quality of people's ability to listen. When that quality goes down and when people don't feel heard or listened to, then that's an indicator that you're going to a dangerous place.
Mm-hmm. No, this sounds very lovely, and I mean it resonates very much with the work that we are doing. That's right, and also what I hear you say is that actively looking for diversity in all kinds of forms, like, and that we as citizens are really interested in diversity, and it's not just being served to us, that we are actively looking for, opposing opinions and see how they feel and listen to people and being curious. That's actually a healthy social immune system. Yeah, that creates those antibodies that I think you talked about.
But one of the problems is that there are bigger sort of socioeconomic dynamics that are preventing that diverse contact. There's a great book written called The Big Sort, which explains how in the United States over the last few decades, people have started to move from mixed neighborhoods to a very homogeneous neighborhood, socioeconomically in terms of income levels and education levels. And so that has created a sort of a blue America and a red America, and so the problem with that is that even if you want to meet people who are different from you, it just so happens that you wake up one morning and all of your neighbors are kind of like you. And so you think, well, I don't know where all the other people have gone, but they're not here. And so that's where things like school districts and housing policy are really, really important.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, beautiful, lovely. So it's kind of a personal and a systemic or structural
Yeah,
thing to think
exactly.
about how to enhance this immune system that we
Yeah,
are talking about, these antibodies that keep the
yeah.
democratic process or society more healthy.
Yes, yes. I mean, I think there's really things that each of us can do to fight these dynamics. Look for, people who are different from you in your company, in your gym, in your sports club, in your school. Like that intergroup contact can happen everywhere. I mean, getting off our phones is a good start. Social media is not good for us, but also the phone is just absorbs us and cuts us off from other people. So there's lots of things people can actually do.
Yeah, right. Very much so. So what I hear you say, on the one hand, actively engage. There are many things you can do to kind of. I also feel that when I listen to you, when you talk, then I feel like it creates immediately more oxygen. It's kind of feels fresh, and the air feels fresher, and it feels interesting because it sparks our curiosity and also our learning, I think. And we all know that social media and our phones create this kind of suits, the suits of homogeneity or like sameness. And so getting off that is very helpful. And then I'm curious. This is a very interesting conversation. Like I love what you're bringing, and I think it's very interesting to get this more out, like all the things that you found through your surveys that actually contradict a bit the main information. um, I'm curious now, because to me it seems whenever, and you said it before, because we assumed that COVID would maybe create more togetherness, but it didn't. So on the other hand, we could say every time there's a bigger collective stress factor that touches the collective, like the society, the societal body, it might reinforce this kind of fragmentation. And I'm wondering now, how you look at it. Let's say climate change. You mentioned it before, and there are others, but let's stay with one for a moment. to make it more simple, when there is a stress factor coming that is kind of continuously turning up, literally and metaphorically, the heat in the system. So basically, the resilience that we have is going to be challenged more and more. So isn't that a natural way into a deeper and deeper fragmentation? And isn't that a natural way segue into, like what you mentioned before with the movie, the Civil War? Like you said, okay, yeah, we are not in Aleppo, and at the same time, it's not so far out. And there is a very concrete stress factor that is gonna turn up the heat, and like we are turning up the heat in our own water. So isn't that naturally going there? And if so, maybe not. I'm curious what you're saying. And if so, what do we actually have to learn or evolve into or express in a new way not to go there, even if that stress factor is there? So I'm curious about your take on that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm an optimist, but sometimes it's hard to be an optimist. So there's no doubt that the stress placed by the growing threat of that climate change poses to our societies, to our livelihoods, to our food, to um, it's massive, and it's so multidimensional. Perhaps a problem with that threat is that it still feels very distant for so many people. So making it present is a real challenge. And I think a mistake that has been made for too long is to describe global goals, 1.5 degrees at the 2050 horizon, which is both scientifically enormously important and feels so far removed from the lives of so many people who say, I don't know what 1.5 degrees means. Doesn't sound like a lot. 2050 is like, most people have difficulty making ends meet at the end of the month. So 2050 really sounds like, I have no idea. So I think the climate movement has done a much better job at making things a bit more closer to talk about food and to talk about people's livelihoods, etc. So that's helped. But certainly it presents a challenge to us like never before. So, but I still think that we can have the capacity to come together to solve those challenges, but there will still be tension and disagreements and about how we deal with this, and there still will be sort of winners or losers from these transitions. But I think there's just a way to lower the temperature on the sort of social temperature, not the temperature of the earth, but lower the temperature on polarization on so many of the other issues that, frankly, we shouldn't be arguing about. I mean, arguing about COVID vaccines or masks sounds, to me at least, that's just my opinion, that was not necessary. That was entirely avoidable kind of disagreement. We should be focusing on other things that are really existential and really sources of disagreement. So, but I agree with you that's why there's urgency to this work. Because, as I was saying earlier, I really fundamentally believe that we will not be able to tackle the shared challenge of climate change if we continue to be this divided. We just won't make it. So it's very urgent.